Last night, Parliament endorsed the government's plans to lock in the £4 billion cut to overseas aid until public finances are back under control, that is. Aid spending will remain at 0.5% rather than 0.7% of gross national income until the government balances the day-to-day budget for day-to-day spending and public debt is once again falling as a proportion of GDP. That's excluding Bank of England debt. Despite the government winning the vote, there were a number of Conservative rebels. Among them were Theresa May, Jeremy Hunt, David Davis and Defence Select Committee Chairman Tobias Ellwood. Well, joining us now is Tobias Ellwood himself to talk us through why there were so many Tory rebels on this aid cut vote. Welcome to the show, Tobias.
Good morning.
Clearly, the government squeaked in with a majority of 35, maybe a larger majority than was being expected earlier in the day. Why did this rebellion fail?
Well, I can't find a minister who privately actually agrees with the direction of travel, and I'm really sorry that we've gone down this road. You introduced me as the chair of the Defence Select Committee, and from where I sit, the world is becoming increasingly more dangerous and more complex. There's very much a 1930s feel to the world right now. The threats are increasing, diversifying, authoritarianism is rising, extremism hasn't gone away despite our successes in the Middle East. We've got an ever-assertive China and Russia, and of course climate change is going to present a whole new host of challenges, and we need to make sure that we have the soft power and hard power to deal with what's coming over the horizon. So I think this is a retrograde step, and I would say that soft power is something we do well. Influence the world as a force for good, our statecraft, our thought leadership. We're taking a reputational hit by reducing our overseas aid budget at the very time when all the other G7 nations are actually increasing theirs.
You say we're going to take a reputational hit from this, but of course the overseas aid budget doesn't include our enormous contribution to the WHO, it doesn't include our COVAX spending, it doesn't include a lot of things that Britain is doing above and beyond many other countries in the world. And of course, we're still spending £10 billion on foreign aid. It's been cut from 14 to £10 billion, still more than countries like France and many other European countries. Does this not show that we are still sort of ahead of the pack, if not as far in the lead as we once were?
Certainly, we shouldn't take away from the contributions that are being made, and I'd absolutely agree with you that from a taxpayer's perspective, we should include those things. But all I'm saying is, from a very much a defence and security perspective, the next 10 years is going to get very, very bumpy indeed. And there's a consequence of when we withdraw these programs. Firstly, from an operational impact, when you close medical centres and so forth, people will be affected. Fewer girls will be educated. More people will grow hungry because we're pulling out of places like Yemen, Libya, Syria, and so forth. And more girls and boys will become slaves. And then on the bigger picture, when we depart, we leave a vacuum which is often filled by China. And I make it really, really clear. I believe there's actually a new Cold War developing, a soft power Cold War. China is advancing its own influence through its One Belt, One Road strategies, its gifting of 5G and its military sharing of technologies as well to further its own influence across the world. The West is actually shrinking. So our soft power absolutely counts. When we retreat from our programs in Africa, we are replaced by China and to some degree Russia as well. So from a prosperity perspective, this will damage us in the long term.
You make an incredibly powerful point about the rise of China, and I'm sure it's one that many people will agree with you on. It does strike me as a little bit odd, therefore, that last year, through DFID, through the UK International Aid Programme, we were giving money to China. Isn't this the sort of thing that we shouldn't be doing at all? And doesn't a cut like this make us think about potentially not giving money to countries with their own space programmes?
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. If I was in charge of the different programmes, we'd be spending money in very different areas. I mean, the Caribbean, when we have the hurricane season there, that's where I think taxpayers would be happy to see our support go. We're just retreating from Afghanistan, leaving the country, in the hands of the very insurgent organization, that we tried to defeat in the first place, making it another haven for terrorist groups. And as a military person myself, so many times, I've gone into areas of operation where we've defeated the enemy but then lost the peace. So there are there's absolutely better ways that we can spend this aid money. And like I said, we need to advance from calling it simply overseas aid and label it as soft power. And I think if we did that with the changes in how we spend, altering the spending formula, which isn't decided by us, by the way, it's decided by the OECD. And those rules were made after the Second World War, and they are completely out of date. And you made that point yourself. So there's so much more that we can do, but cutting back this does not make sense. And let's go to the heart as to why it's being cut. It's because of the pandemic. 400 billion pounds is a lot of money to pay back. But we're comparing this with the Second World War. We didn't pay back the Second World War debt in one or two parliaments. We did it over a couple of generations. In fact, the final war debt was signed off, was completed when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. And I believe we should do the same with this once in a generational debt as well, because the 1% pay rise for NHS, for example, is completely unacceptable, but again, been affected by the cost of the pandemic. So let's create that fiscal instrument that is similar to our war debt to deal with the pandemic.
And Tobias, just lastly, I mean, I've listened very carefully to you, and you sort of talked about boys and girls going hungry abroad, and you've talked about sort of the prosperity internationally. And there'll be some people, I mean, 54% of the general population actually do think the government is spending too much on overseas aid, and that goes up to 78% for Conservatives. So clearly this policy that has a lot of support, this cutting back of the aid. And there'll be people listening to you and saying, well, what about the boys and girls going hungry in this country? What about the prosperity of my local community? And they'll be listening to you speak, and they'll be saying you're focused on what's going on abroad and not all the problems we're facing here. What would you say to those people?
Well, I completely understand that. During the pandemic, of course, we need to look after ourselves, but this money had already been earmarked. It was already being spent. It was on programs to prevent girls and boys becoming slaves, to prevent poverty, and also to prevent people from dying because there wasn't enough food. The food programs that we're involved with have now been closed down with huge consequences. So the money was already allocated, and we've decided to then pull back from that. So I think that's not as responsible as we should be. But I'm making it very clear how we could get around this financial challenge that we face, not to dismiss the issues that we face domestically. But this is also a pandemic. This affects every country around the world. And again, look what we did a couple of times last century. It was Britain that stepped forward when perhaps others hesitated. We then took other nations with us. If there's a real challenge of the next 10 to 20 years, is the absence of Western leadership, which I'm afraid our adversaries are taking full advantage of. Britain and America need to step forward and show some resolve as to what the West stands for, what we believe in, what we're willing to defend, how we can actually work together more. And that requires advancement and investment in our soft power and our hard power.
I suppose to end on one note of unity, the Prime Minister said last night that, of course, the vote means that when we return to a balanced budget for day-to-day spending and when debt is again falling as a percentage of GDP, we will return to 0.7%. So I suppose we can leave it on that. A new crusade, perhaps, for people who want to increase aid spending to balance the current budget overall. But Tobias Ellwood, thank you so much for joining us this morning on GB News.
Thank you.